Okay, so today we're very happy to have Nisha Chandramurthy from UChicago Stats, who will tell us about understanding learning generative models for physical systems.
Thank you so much, Ewan and Mariante and everybody for inviting me and for coming, and also for a really nice lunch. I will step on the mat. So my talk will be about generative models, which I guess we all use on a day-to-day basis now, but it will be in a somewhat idealized setting with none of the complexities of something like a language model. But I will not assume any familiarity with generative models, just probability and stochastic processes. And if there is something that is not clear, do please let me know. So the first part is joint work with PhD student Adrian over there, and some of the numeric results are also due to an undergraduate student, Sebastian, also at UChicago. And some part towards the end of the talk, if I get there, is joint work with Georg Gottwald, who is at University of Sydney. Okay, so what are generative models? So at a very high level, we should think of generative models as machine learning algorithms that take in some samples, which take in some finite number of samples, which are written as x1 to xm from some unknown probability distribution, which I will throughout the talk refer to as p data. And then they're tasked with producing more samples, hopefully also from p data. Now, usually the context these models are used in, p data is a singular distribution. It doesn't have full support in R big D, which you should think of as the ambient dimension. Instead, it has a lower dimensional support in little d. And maybe somewhat imprecisely in the machine learning world, people refer to the support of p data as a data manifold. But we don't really know any properties of it as a manifold, whether it's a manifold, what is the smoothness, what is the parameterization of it. We have no idea. But sometimes I would also use this very imprecise term. Data manifold just means the support of the data distribution. And for the purpose of the analysis, you should really think of this as some compact set in a Euclidean space. But the important thing is that it is usually little d dimensional, and little d is less than capital D, which is the ambient dimension. So usually these algorithms achieve this sampling from p data by learning a dynamical system. So you can think of there being a coupling between an easy distribution, which will be referred to as p0, and p data. Now p0 is just a distribution typically with density, so it has full support in R big D, from which you can generate samples at will. So think like a Gaussian distribution or so. And p data is the target distribution, which we only have information about through the samples. There is no other information about p data that is available to the model. And they accomplish this by learning this dynamical system, which can be discrete time, or it can be continuous time dynamics. It can be deterministic, or it can be stochastic dynamics. For the first part of the talk, let's assume we have a deterministic dynamical system. So it's just a flow of a vector field. So I will just put it, show this here. I'll just use white, it's easier to see. Yeah, so let me just write it in ODE notation. You have an ODE, which is non-autonomous vector field. The vector field itself depends on time, and which simply induces a coupling between an easy distribution P0 and P data, in the sense that if you take an initial condition of this ODE that samples from the easy distribution at a finite time tau, this is the solution of this ODE with at a finite time tau. This is from P data. Okay. Of course, there are infinitely many possible such couplings given a fixed distribution P0 and P data, and therefore many possible solutions to this vector field Vt. And generative models learn any such vector fields, and that's why there are many interesting questions, because things can go wrong when you try to learn a vector field for which there are many possible, so it's a non-unique optimization problem. To give you some context for P data itself, now in machine learning, they usually try to sample from distributions of cats and dogs and so on. So you can think of these as some samples with an ambient dimension being very, very high. So if you take the number of pixels in the image and multiply by 3 for the number of colors, that's how many pieces of information you need to describe this high dimensional vector. This is usually in the millions. Right? So big D is in the millions, but little d arguably is much smaller. This in machine learning is what is referred to as a manifold hypothesis that was proposed sometime in 2013 and empirically illustrated here. So the idea is that if you have a controllable generative model where you can prescribe the intrinsic dimension of the samples to generate, and that's written as d bar over here, if it is too low, the images that are generated are quite wrong. So really, they're not really learning all aspects or features of the distribution. On the other hand, if you specify an intrinsic dimension that is much higher, you also generate some nonsense which may not be from P data. So there is the belief that there is some dimension, intrinsic dimension d, for which there is P data is actually supported in a set of that dimension. Okay. In this case, that dimension turns out to be something like on the order of 30, which is much, much smaller than the million dimension, the ambient dimension. So the idea is that the data are really low dimensional, and that's where lies the magic of sampling. Now, in the physical sciences, we often care about also the same problem of sampling from high dimensional distributions, but again, there is a low dimensional structure. You may have seen this picture of a Lorenz attractor, which is proposed as a often used model for a chaotic system. These data are of course generated by solving a very simple set of ordinary differential equations that produce complex behavior. And what I'm showing you here are the unstable subspaces of the Lorenz attractor. And one can argue that this is indeed the lower dimensional, the unstable subspace is one dimensional, and this is the lower dimensional structure, and the ambient space is 3 dimensional. In a more cartoon setting, you can think that in physical systems, we care about sampling from a probability distribution that disintegrates in maybe this following way, where along some dimensions you have a density, and in some other dimensions you don't. It acts essentially as a discrete or a singular distribution. In this case, let's say you have a density along this x direction, but no density along y direction. And for the purpose of generative modeling, we can argue if there is a set of ODEs that can actually generate from distributions with a low dimensional support, then why learn a different vector field, right? That's a valid question. In principle, these actual dynamics that sample from these distributions are often unknown. And the second reason is that you don't usually want to sample from the invariant distribution of a dynamical system. You want to use those samples for a downstream task, like Bayesian inference or any other parameter estimation problems and so on, data assimilation problems. These are all computational problems that are used in various science and engineering applications, and all of them involve some transformation of measures. In this case, what I showed you was an example of what's called an SRB measure. These are transformations of things like SRB measures that have low dimensional support, and we care about sampling from these distributions. And in a very, very idealized scenario, what we would love to be able to do is not learn the dynamical system on the entirety of the space, but actually learn it only where it is absolutely continuous, but a priori we don't know the directions in which it is absolutely continuous. But given this setup, what we care about in the context of sampling from physical systems or any P data for which we know that there is a low dimensional structure is to understand exactly what existing generative models do. Okay. So we want to know, okay, we have a generative model that is potentially sampling points from this underlying data manifold, but how does it accomplish this task? Okay. And so, at least in the first part of this talk, this will be our focus. So we ask, can a generative model learn the data, support of the data, and if yes, in what sense? And then, of course, as I said, that there are infinitely many solutions to this vector field VT, and one such is picked up by a generative model by solving an optimization problem. So this optimization problem will have errors, and so if you make an error, how does it affect the distribution that you are ultimately going to sample from? And finally, this is also an application that I find very interesting, is that if we hopefully study generative models as dynamical systems, we can ultimately control them to maybe sample from regions of P data that is of interest to us. So if we knew that P data has heavy tails, maybe we want to sample from these heavy tail distributions. So we want to tilt the distribution so as to be able to push samples towards this region. And for all these reasons, we ask some elementary questions about this vector field VT, or the set of possible vector fields VT that are learned by the algorithm. If there are any questions, please do let me know. Okay, so here is the setup. So as I mentioned, there is a vector field VT, and this is only one interpretation of generative models. Okay. So in this talk, I want to give you two interpretations. The first one is that you should really think of this as a probability flow through an ODE, and the ODE is not autonomous. Okay. In one, I would say there are two maybe core ideas that underlie dynamical generative models, and one idea is that of diffusions. Okay. Where's this chalk? Okay. One possible vector field that is often used, I should say that if this is the vector field, probability flow under this flow of the vector field will satisfy the continuity equation. So you have a PDE, which gives you a divergence, where rho t is the density. So rho 0 is the density of P0. I will interchange, maybe be a bit loose and say this is the density of P0. And rho tau is supposed to be the density of P data. Okay, but P data may or may not have a density. Okay, so you can think of rho tau as something like the convolution of P data, the density corresponding to the convolution of P data with some small noise, so that it has full support. So that is rho tau. Now, can I write here if it is?
Sure.
So, a very important vector field turns out to be a vector field that is called, maybe this is a cotangent field, called the score of a probability distribution. Okay. So this thing, we will define this to be a score. Okay. A score is just the gradient log of the density of a probability distribution. It's only defined for distributions with densities. Okay. And the score is just gradient log density. So from now on, I'll just be using the word score to refer to this object. Now, if you take a vector field that is exactly this, right, and put it in the continuity equation, you can see with a little bit of algebra that this just becomes like a heat equation. Maybe I should take take Vt equals negative gradient of log t. Then you will get this the heat equation, for which the fundamental solution is just a Gaussian. Okay, so really, these sequence of densities, which you get from a simple process, from a Brownian motion, really, you can think of as also in a deterministic setup where Vt is the gradient of log rho t. And if you have a set of Gaussians, then gradient log of a Gaussian will just be a linear vector field. So it's linear transport of particles in sample space. Yeah.
So if your formula for Vt is gradient log rho t, does that mean Vt of x, like x doesn't have to be the value at a point? It can depend, it can take derivative as x, it can...
Yeah, you should really think of vector fields as functions. So when I write Vt is this, I'm writing the equality between two functions. So the vector field is actually a map where this is a tangent vector in some R big D. Okay,
but my
so
question
you
is...
can evaluate it anywhere.
No, my question is Vt doesn't just depend on x at a point. It can depend on derivatives of x, higher derivatives. It can depend on x as a whole even at the same, at that point.
Yeah, it can depend.
So like I'm saying, it could be a higher order differential equation. It doesn't have to be first order.
So we do only consider first order differential equations, no higher order differential equations. So, yeah. But Vt can be a very complicated function of the space, but the equation itself is always first order in time.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Right, and it's this. Okay. Now, so as I was saying, so if you take a heat equation, you can see that you can realize this alternatively as just a Brownian motion, or you can also realize this through an ODE, which if you take a linear path on sample space, you can still produce the same set of densities. Okay, and there is a time reversal or a reparameterization that I will discuss only in the second part of the talk. Okay. But the upshot is that an important vector field that neural networks tend to approximate in generative models is the score as an object itself. And the score is not just one score, but a sequence of scores or a family of scores for a family of densities rho t that come from some dynamics, that are marginals of some dynamics. And how exactly they sample these, how exactly they learn these vector fields is by solving an optimization problem. Okay? If Vt over there is the true vector field and V theta t is a neural network that is trying to represent this vector field, okay, we solve an optimization problem to make them close to each other. And you can see why this is a very difficult problem to solve, because there are infinitely many answers Vt which the neural network can represent and actually get the answer to P data, sample from P data. But there are various conveniences or constraints that are imposed on V theta t to make the problem tractable. And this is not beyond the scope of this talk. Okay. But the second part, or the second core idea I wanted to say, is that instead of approximating these object scores, a second class of algorithms based on flow matching, they approximate the vector field based on a different principle, not based on scores. Okay. But in any case, there is a vector field that is represented, and that approximate vector field is V theta, which is not equal to Vt. Okay. V theta t not equal to Vt. Okay. So this is a generative model, and this is what happens under the hood. But I got interested in this because one day I just downloaded this generative model and saw this, and I'm really not the first person to have made this observation. But the idea in these pictures is the following. On the left, you see the samples that are generated, actually samples from a data set, which is a benchmark data set used in machine learning called CFAR10. Exactly what it is unimportant. It's just a bunch of pictures. Okay. Now, on the right, you see a generative model that is sampling from this data set. But now, I take the trained generative model and arbitrarily add errors to the vector field. And now I run the ODE, and now the generated samples still look like they could very much be from the same data set. So you ask the question, even under errors, you still seem to recover samples that could plausibly be from P data. When is this true? And does this always happen? You can see this more in lower dimensions. So in this two-dimensional case, let's look at this as the target density. So this is our P data. So the data are coming from these two moons. One can argue this is a low dimensional distribution, although because we've plotted the kernel density estimate, it looks absolutely continuous in R2, but it isn't. Now, on the right, you see the density generated, but by a vector field which is incorrect because errors have been added to it. So, of course, as expected, the density itself is incorrect when compared to the target density, but one can see that it is incorrect in an interesting way, in the sense that if you stare at this density, you can still recover, at least as a human, the support of the true target distribution. On the other hand, this is not always true. It's not that you can just add errors to any generative model and you can always recover something that produces interesting errors. Here is a different kind of generative model, where when you add order 1 errors to the vector field, then you get a distribution that doesn't make mistakes similar to this distribution. In other words, this is just arbitrarily wrong. Here is another generative model that also looks arbitrarily wrong. So then we set out to ask the question, if some generative models can make errors, and these errors can still be such that you can recover the support of the target distribution, then when does this happen? Here is another physical example, again from the Lorentz 63 system. So on the left, you can see that, here on the left is the distribution generated by a diffusion model, which is a generative model. And the color is according to the Lyapunov exponents that are computed from the diffusion model. The Lyapunov exponents are all over the place when compared to the real Lorentz 63 vector field that should give you one positive Lyapunov exponent, one close to 0, and one negative. And here is the same picture, now colored by the angle between a vector field associated with the generative model and the unstable vector field of the unstable subspace of the Lorentz system. And the angles are also all over the place. So really, it's not learning the Lorentz system. The way it's doing generation is not the same way the Lorentz ODE is doing the generation. But this is not a surprise because we don't teach it the dynamical system, we're only giving it samples. So to understand the behavior of generative models and when they can still sample from close to the support of the target distribution, we can think of generative models as random dynamical systems. So instead of an ODE, as I said, you could have used a Brownian motion or something like an SDE to also do the sampling. And so to think of all these models in a unified framework, we can think of them as a random dynamical system. Okay. Which many people in this department are also working on and have made many contributions to. In this case, we're thinking of random dynamical systems just as the only type of random dynamical system we're thinking of here is SDEs, or discretizations of SDEs to be more precise, time integrations of SDEs, where you can think at each time you're applying a different map, F with the subscript of T, and the W here stands for the random parameter, like a Wiener path when you're sampling an SDE. In a score-based generative model, you have, this is an Euler-Maruyama step of, time integration of an SDE, where S is a score that is approximated by a neural network, and WT are Gaussian random variables. So here is our true generative model. So let's assume this is the ground truth. It's a random dynamical system, iterates of which we're going to analyze. Okay. So at each time we apply F with the subscript of T, and F with the superscript of T just means the composition of all these maps. Now, to model errors in a generative model that come from approximately solving the optimization problem as opposed to exactly solving the optimization problem to recover a VT. Maybe I should clarify that. Earlier I was referring to VT. You can just think of FT as like FT of an X is the identity map applied to X plus, which is just X plus some little delta T times VT of X. Okay. So it's a one-step time integration. But now, because we don't have access to FT, we're dealing with some FT plus, let's say, an additive error of magnitude epsilon, and the direction of error is represented by this unit vector field chi t. Okay. And if you want to understand how errors propagate, you'll have to read along sample paths. Then you have to consider the lift of errors, which is just a linearization of vector fields along the dynamics. So now you have, these are vector fields that are pushed forward by the linearized dynamics. This is the Jacobian of gradient of Ft, the Jacobian matrix. And on the space of probabilities, if instead of sampling with the dynamics Ft, if you sample to the dynamics Ft epsilon, which is the dynamics with some error for some non-zero epsilon, then instead of the marginals Pt, which are exactly going to converge to P data, so x tau samples from P tau, which is the same as P data, but P tau epsilon, which is generated by solving this problem instead, is not going to be P data. Okay. But it will have its own evolution given by this transfer operator. Now we want to use this framework to explain why sometimes the support of what you get of this Pt epsilon is not the same as the support of P data. But if you try to do this by assuming that P data has densities, then you don't get the answer. Okay? So if with some simple algebra, some integration by parts, you can derive this expression. If you assume absolute continuity on both sides, P0 is absolutely continuous, P tau is also absolutely continuous, then you can derive that if you differentiate rho epsilon, which is the density of the target P tau with the epsilon. Okay, where do I write this? Rho epsilon is the density of P tau epsilon, okay, and rho, just rho, is the density of the target. Now I kept saying that the target does not have density, but just for this slide, assume that it does. Okay. I hope you can all read this. Okay. If you do assume that the target has a density, then we get this expression for the derivative of the generated density with respect to epsilon. So for epsilon being close to 0, so up to first order and epsilon, you can interpret this as the change in the density at a given x is on the order of epsilon times P tau multiplied by what is shown in red is just some continuous bounded scalar field. Okay. So let's ignore that for a moment, and it just comes from the calculation. But the important thing to notice is that this derivative is epsilon change in the derivative is epsilon multiplied by the target density itself. So for small epsilon, the change is only supported where the target itself is supported. So if rho is 0, then the change is also 0 at that x. In other words, you expect that when both these distributions are absolutely continuous with respect to Lebesgue, you don't expect generative models to really be very sensitive, the support of the generative models to be very sensitive to small errors. So, which is why I already told you that this result will not explain why there might be a lack of robustness. Because in these examples, maybe we see a lack of robustness of the support to errors because the target is not absolutely continuous. So we need to be a bit more precise or fine-grained about which directions the errors are growing in when you make an error in your optimization problem. Everybody is very quiet. If you want to interrupt me at some point, please feel free to. Otherwise, I'll just assume it's already clear. Okay. In order to get some directionality on where the errors are growing, let's consider again the linearized map, gradient of ft. And if you consider some arbitrary linear subspace at time 0 of dimension little d, and propagate it through the linearized dynamics, okay, which you basically just get by multiplying the Jacobian by these directions. And in this case, I have done a QR factorization to maintain the norm of ET. So the norm of ET, it always has orthogonal columns, orthonormal columns, and the R matrix. This is a QR factorization of this matrix of size capital D times small d. If you do this for an infinitely long time, there is theory, at least in deterministic systems, that these will converge to what are called oscillated subspaces, which comes from Oscillator's theory, or it is Lyapunov exponents and Lyapunov vectors. But for the purpose of this analysis, everything is in finite time. We don't think of asymptotic time, and so we just constructively define these subspaces and refer to them by a different name, not Lyapunov or oscillated subspaces, but I'll just call them the most sensitive subspaces, okay? Because it's not exactly the same, because the time is not tending to infinity. Now, therefore, at time tau, you should interpret E tau that is obtained from this construction as the directions in which errors will grow the most. Now, it's possible that every direction is stable under the linearized dynamics, so all errors will decay. But some are decaying faster than the others. And these are the fastest, these are the slowest decaying directions if they are all stable. And if there is any instability, these will contain the unstable directions for the growth of error along paths of the dynamics. Okay. Yeah.
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Yes.
If you
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, if you choose E0 as a random subspace, then E tau is also not, it'll depend on the choice of E0.
That's right.
So we're going to get different E taus. How can you call them the most sensitive? Maybe they're all sensitive.
That's a good question. So actually the convergence of E, if you start with some random subspace and you iterate this procedure, the convergence to oscillated subspaces actually depends on the gap in the Lyapunov exponents. And usually these systems are very stable and have a large gap such that the E0 doesn't really matter. You can, at least empirically, we have seen that you can choose many different E0, and as long as your tau is not one step, there's some number of steps, we get some E tau that becomes a characteristic only of, it becomes a genuine vector field that is independent of E0. Good question. So now E tau are these top little d. I'm sorry for using the Lyapunov vectors, but they're only approximate. Okay, approximate Lyapunov vectors. They are the least stable directions of error propagation under the linearized dynamics. Just to visualize them, we show them here in by these lines in black at various points. And you might notice something, which is that they seem eerily close to being tangent to the data manifold itself. In this case, the curve on which the data are supported. And so we decided to just formalize this property. Okay, so we will say that a generative model, which is a dynamical system, is called aligned if its E tau, which are the most sensitive directions at time tau, are perfectly aligned with the tangent space of the data manifold at every point. Okay. So these things would qualify as aligned generative models. And we can show, and this result I'm just stating informally, we can show that generative models that are aligned can learn the data manifold in the sense I'm about to tell you. Okay. To learn the support of a distribution is actually quite a simple problem, right? Because you have to learn a binary classifier that tells you maybe 1 if you're on the support and 0 or -1 if you're off the support. Okay. And the question is statistical in nature. Given samples from a generative model, which is some fake dynamical system that's just generating samples, supposedly from the support of the target distribution, can you learn a binary classifier as well as you can with the same number of samples, really from the data distribution? So that's the question we can ask about incorrect generative models. Okay? If you really had a correct generative model, in principle, if you generated infinitely many samples from the correct generative model, then you can learn a classifier because you can solve this classification problem and you can get guarantees, statistical guarantees for, it'll go down as 1 over square root of n, the error in your classifier, where n is the number of samples that you use to learn the classifier. Okay. But can you do the same now with an incorrect generative model? It turns out that you can, and in fact recover the same asymptotic learning rates with the incorrect generative model if you have the alignment property. So, but just having the alignment property is not enough. You also need that the generative model actually converges. In other words, if you have a, maybe I will use this very helpful device. Oh, just pull strong. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so what is a convergent generative model? Well, you can say that if you looked at the P tau that was generated by a neural network, then the Wasserstein distance, or you can define various types of distances, but the result I used here is a W1 distance between this and P data is on the order of some epsilon to the C, where epsilon, is not the same as that epsilon, is the epsilon in the optimization problem. Sorry, my bad. Maybe I'll use a different letter. But this is how well you learn the vector field at each time. Okay, I'm just being a bit informal. This cursor is usually terrible. Okay, but the point is that square-based diffusion models and many classes of generative models do come with convergence guarantees of this form, in that if you let the number of samples tend to infinity, that you recover an exact vector field, then you recover the exact distribution in a Wasserstein sense. If you had such a, and this is not my result, there are several works that have proved convergence of generative models in this sense, but it doesn't really answer our question of if you have a convergent generative model, but the delta is not 0, can you recover the support? So can you learn this binary classifier that I was telling you about. It turns out that you can, if you have the alignment property, because convergence tells you that there is an optimal transport map of a small norm that exists between P data and the generated distribution. And alignment tells you that if there is any error that is made in the model, that the error will push the samples in the directions where it is most sensitive to, which is along these E tau, but these directions are perfectly tangent to the data manifold. Therefore, it does not change the error of any classifier you try to learn for this set, as long as this set is well behaved, the support is well behaved. So you can see that, sorry if I was unclear or went a bit fast, but this is what it means empirically. Okay. So suppose you have a generative model that produces, this is a sample from P0, which is the nice distribution. And this is what is produced by a generative model that is learning well, let's say. So it is producing a digit that it was trained on. You may have seen this data set of handwritten digits. Okay. Now, in the third picture, you have the same 4 plus the first column of E tau, which is the most sensitive direction. Okay. And you can see that this still looks very much like a 4. And the last picture is the second picture, which has a 4 plus the 100th most sensitive Lyapunov vector. Okay. And this doesn't look quite as good. Okay. So you can interpret this as this being off the manifold. Or in other words, only the first few columns of E tau as forming a basis for the tangent space of the manifold. But the other directions are not tangent to the manifold. So this is consistent with several works that have come out in the last few years that have variously described properties of generative models as learning the underlying support of the data distribution or learning the dimension of the manifold and so on. This is probably a different spin on the same idea, which is, or at least the same observation, which is that in this sense of learning the support, a generative model that is aligned does really well. And here is also another qualitative description of what we mean by it is doing really well, is if you calculate the finite time Lyapunov exponents of the aligned generative model, for these models, the most sensitive subspecies are actually tangent to the data manifold, or at least empirically we observe them to be, then we see that the first few Lyapunov exponents that roughly speaking correspond to what has been worked out as the intrinsic dimension of this MNIST data set, which is around 15 or so. Those seem very well separated or less stable compared to this whole band of Lyapunov exponents that are more stable. So the least stable directions and the corresponding eigenvectors or the Lyapunov vectors are tangent to the data manifold, and all others that are very stable are pushing you very stably towards the data manifold. Now, with these most sensitive directions being constructively defined, so you can compute them with linear algebraic calculations, and therefore hopefully these things scale even to higher dimensions. In applications, if we had an aligned model, it's possible to actually learn the directions of tangent to the data manifold, which can be very informative. If you think something like in language, we had a small, maybe a tiny language model, it would be very interesting if you had an aligned generative model, if you could actually learn the data manifold simply by running the generative model and these linear algebraic calculations on top to recover eta. And of course, we would like to see for physical systems, if this is possible, you learn a physico-dynamical system just from the data, and then you try to compute these directions. Are these, if it is aligned, then truly this would correspond to meaningful directions for the physical problem. But that leads us to the question of, it's nice to have alignment, but how do you ensure that we do? Okay. Given an arbitrary generative model, which means an arbitrary vector field Vt that just has the correct p0 and p tau, how can we ensure alignment? And I actually don't know the answer, but there may be some clues in the dynamics. So I will just leave you with an informal statement, which I think corresponds to the fact that you could have many different dynamics. You could have many different vector fields that have the alignment property. And where to look is this statement. Where to look to derive a sufficient condition for alignment is this statement, which I will explain in a moment. So if you look at this equation, which is just the ODE, right? You can derive the corresponding continuity equation, no surprises. Okay? You can also do this for the discretized. In my slides, the dynamic ecosystem is time discrete, so you can equivalently derive the transfer operator or the push forward operator under the dynamics to get the evolution of the densities. On top of this, you can also get an evolution of the scores or gradient log of the densities. Okay. Now, if you project these scores onto the subspaces, the projections themselves form a recursive equation. And in the case of STEs, they will form a PDE. And therefore, it gives you a way to say the evolution of components of the score in different directions satisfy a PDE, and hopefully the PDE can be controlled in order to get your generative model to be aligned in whichever way you want. Now, I don't know how to make that last step, but at least it's an observation that you can make components of the score along different directions that are differentially sensitive to the dynamics. And hopefully, this can give you a way to more generally control errors along sample paths of generative models. Okay. And in the last 10 minutes or so, I wanted to discuss also generative models, but give you a slightly different interpretation. What else can you do if you think of generative models as dynamic systems? I will pause here, mainly because I want to drink water, but also if you have questions. Oops. Yeah.
I have a very naive question. How does the previous mechanism interact with trying to first do some sort of a dimension reduction method on your manifold? I'm not even talking manifold ordering, just simple PCA.
Are you asking, can I paraphrase your question as, are there any implications for thinking about these component-wise for doing dimension reduction? Yeah, that's a good question. So, suppose you had an aligned generative model, right? You are doing something better than PCA by calculating E tau, right? Because you are really getting tangent spaces to the data manifold. This is a non-linear, this will give you a x-dependent tangent space, whereas PCA will give you like a linear, it will linearize everything, right? So you get the same, you don't get a vector field, but just a set of vectors, right? Now, if you did manifold learning techniques, you do something that is different, right? Possibly better. However, I think there is more information in the generative models than in a manifold learning algorithm that doesn't try to sample from P data. And the reason I think this is, if you just have samples and think of them as data clouds, okay, you will, and then use this for dimension reduction, let's say manifold learning. The vectors you recover contain useless information. Then if you take these data clouds and move them somewhere until you get noise, and then you use all the directions in which these sample paths are traveling to become perfectly Gaussian, it seems to me that you should have more information about the manifolds in the second case. So ultimately it would be a nice idea to exploit generative models for manifold learning, but it is often thought of as an easier problem to do manifold learning than to do generation. So people may not be very happy if I said, here is the most elaborate way to learn your manifold. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, in this part of the talk, I wanted to talk about what can we do to push this idea of viewing these generative models as dynamic ecosystems even further. And to understand this, I have to give you a different interpretation of generative models. This is also an existing interpretation, not a new one, but it will be helpful to know this. So, in score-based generative models, I said that the score is a very important object, and this is often like a vector field that is learned or approximated by the neural network. Right? Now, where this comes from can also be interpreted in the following way. So if you take a simple, like an elementary stochastic process, in this case I have written down an OU process, starting with the data distribution. Of course, the data distribution itself is unknown. So when I say starting with the data distribution, I really mean in practice, you take one of the samples that you're given as the initial condition and run an OU process. Okay. So you will have yt as just being some linear function of the initial condition plus some noise, which is Gaussian. And now you can consider a reverse process. This is in no sense a time reversal of the, it's not possible to reverse this noising process, but it is a reversal in the following sense. Okay. This reverse process, which looks peculiar, looks a bit like the OU process, has the same drift term, and then there is this other term where the score appears, where the score is gradient log of the densities of the forward process, of the OU process. These are the scores of the OU process, starting with P data. Then what happens is that if you run the forward process using P data and you start this reverse process backwards in time by taking the noised samples from the forward process and running this reverse process, then the reverse process samples from P data at a finite time tau. Another way to see this is that this OU process and this process have the same Fokker-Planck solutions, just time reversals of each other. And this is why it is able to generate exactly from P data, is basically by just taking from some samples and then running the OU process, which is a very easy thing to do, but running this process backwards to generate more samples from P data. But to generate this process, you need to know the score. And this is why it is approximated as a neural network. Now, if you don't like SDs, you can also think of another way of the reverse process. So you can think of a reverse process differently by saying that I take some noising process. So I take an image, apply a lot of noise. Eventually it will just become Gaussian, white noise. And then to recover an image back, I'm going to define a denoiser as just a conditional expectation of y0 given yt for a large t. Okay. This is also just from algebra, work out the conditional expectation of y0 given yt, you'll notice that the score again appears. So there is no way to denoise without learning the score, seemingly. Right? But, however, we decided to do something very silly, to ask the question of whether is it possible to not learn the score and still denoise in some sense. So if you apply a noising process, you may not go all the way to white noise, but you run a OU process for a finite time. Can you take samples and apply some function, even if it's a silly function, to recover an image or something that looks like an image? And in the spirit of the first part of the talk, we don't actually care about sampling from P data, but rather something from the same support as the P data. Okay? In fact, I can show you that we don't sample from P data. So you can write down the generator of the OU process like this. And then you have these Fokker-Planck solutions of the OU process. which are exactly the same as the Fokker-Planck solutions of the reverse process, but just reversed in time. And then try to say, I'm going to try to approximate the Fokker-Planck solutions. Or in other words, I can approximate this L star operator, but this is a very hard thing to do. People have been trying to solve Fokker-Planck equations in high dimensions forever, and nobody will want to do this over generative models, which are seemingly the end all of everything, right? Because they work so well. Instead, what if we try to approximate, instead of L star, just L, the generator on the space of functions. So the generator is defined on L2, okay? And you don't need to compute, you don't need to really approximate L2, which is impossible. It's an infinite dimensional object, but at least it is linear, and we can seek a finite dimensional approximation or a matrix that represents the action of L on some finite dimensional function space F. Okay. Now,
Sorry, could you please repeat what is the relationship between L and L star?
So L star is the L2 adjoint of L. Sorry, I should have been specific.
Thank you.
So, now, this is also not a new idea. In computational mathematics, approximating operators is a very well-established thing to do, especially linear operators. Okay? There are various methods. You can think Galerkian projections. In some way, you want a matrix that represents your operator. So you want to calculate the entries of a matrix by solving a regression problem. Exactly what regression problem you solve really depends on what's the data you have. Here we have data which are pairs of samples xi from the target and noised samples xi by running the noisy process. There's nothing stopping us from running a noisy process. It's very easy. It's only running the reverse process that is hard because we don't know the score. So we can generate as many noise samples as we want using all the data. Okay? And in addition, we can generate noised samples for fixed Wiener paths. So given a Wiener path W, you can think of this as a dynamical system that is deterministic and generate noise samples. You can change the Wiener path. This is another deterministic dynamical system. You can generate noise samples. They're all coming from different distributions, but nevertheless, these are noise samples. Okay? And using these samples, we can approximate this Koopman operator, e to the t L, actually e to the tau L, where tau is the Fano time, as a matrix KW. Okay. And so, to actually approximate e to the tau L on some finite dimensional subspace, this is a finite line projection, PF, onto the space F, and e to the TL is the actual stochastic Koopman operator. We get this stochastic Koopman operator matrix, okay, which you now can take many samples and actually solve a regression problem to get. No neural networks, linear regression. So then what happens is very interesting. So if you take a whole bunch of samples, to generate a new sample, you use this approximation, matrix approximation of the Koopman operator, and simply invert it on the noise samples. Okay. Now this is a very stupid thing to do because we know that e to the TL is not invertible. Okay. It's a compact operator on L2, but you will have, the spectrum will go, even if you don't have exactly zero, there will be many, I should probably wrap up really soon. Sorry about that. It's not an invertible operator. It should not work, but we do get something meaningful. I will show you that in the bottom, you see these are the real samples from the data set, these handwritten digits. And on the top row are samples that are recovered from this dumb method of just matrix approximation of the stochastic Koopman operator. I do admit that sometimes we get garbage, like the third image, but the rest of the time, starting with this sample, you recover something different. You don't just recover a 5 when you start with a 5, you recover a 2. So, it's not a coincidence, but I cannot tell you why. Like, I have some idea of why this might work, but all I can show is that the generated samples is not, we know that it is not coming from P data. However, it seems to learn samples from the support of P data, and so we're trying to understand why, and this is still some work in progress, but I thought it might be interesting to show you. So I will really stop here. That I just have presented to you a random dynamical systems view of generative models, which are classes of algorithms that represent samples from some target distribution given some samples. We've identified some properties of these generative models which would be useful to have in practice and hopefully lead the way to control these generative models in the future, and also maybe approximate them with easier ways than training neural networks on huge amounts of data. But that is, we'll see if that pans out. But thank you very much for your attention.
Any questions?
I guess if for an aligned model, the kind of error points along the tangent space.
Yeah.
So you expect when there's an error, it's like the data distribution just shifts
Correct.
within the same support.
Exactly.
And I know you said you don't care about the distribution, but like, do you know anything about the distribution? Because maybe it all shifts, but it still ends up with the same distribution, right?
Oh, that's a good question. So I don't think it quite ends up in the same distribution. There are some examples. These are contrived examples. You can construct, say, a vector field that, let's say you want to sample from like a distribution on the circle, okay? And now, if you take a deterministic dynamical system that goes something like this. So if you have some vector field, so somebody showed me this example, which I think is a nice example to answer your question. So let's say here is your vector field. You have a deterministic dynamical system that pushes samples towards this circle, but there is also a rotation. Okay, so you have a rotation. Okay.
Is the rotation the noise or?
No. This is the real dynamics. Okay. Let's say here is a VT. I'm giving you a VT with the same P0, which you can think of as some density on the whole set, and then it's pushing towards the circle, and then it gives you a uniform distribution of the circle. With and without the rotation, you get the uniform distribution as the invariant distribution of this dynamics. Okay. These are rotations on the circle. There are all kinds of things known about them. Okay. Now you can add this small perturbation, which always is going to be exactly a rotation, and this doesn't change the uniform distribution. So in this case, you are correct, right? That even though the distribution is wrong, the distribution is, even though we've only shown that the distribution samples from the same support, in this case, it's actually impossible to make a mistake because it's a uniform distribution. But for a slight perturbation, if I can cause any multimodality on this circle, this property vanishes. You will get a vector field that doesn't learn the rotation. And if you add any kind of noise, it has to be, you can never recover the modes on the circle correctly.
Okay, right.
So in this case, there will be a shift no matter what you do, is what I was trying to say. Yeah. But you'll recover the circle correctly if you're perfectly aligned.
Aligned.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Let's thank the speaker again.